Hi. So my name is Nir, and in the next few minutes we're going to talk about the light subject, which is the messier part of our design system. Okay, so I see a lot of new faces around, so let me introduce myself. So I'm a very proud father and a family man, and I've spent more than the last decade in this industry. The last 6 years I spent at Wix, and since it was Purim, here's a picture taken 5 years ago in a Purim party, in which you see the origin of the amazing UX Studio every today. So today we're going to start by giving some context to what I'm going to talk about and setting the stage. We're going to talk about the system, and we're going to talk about the mess and how we can clean it. So who here has built a website using Wix? Okay, so this is the main product, the editor. Here a user come and basically place the content and design it. In the dashboard or the back office, users come to manage their accounts and manage the business apps. Like in this example, he can manage his store, his blog, his email marketing campaign, and more. Now, what you see here is actually a glimpse of the Wix ecosystem, in which more than 20 different companies or product teams, which each build like a startup with a head of company and different roles like developers and UX designers, analysts, product managers, and more, each focuses on their own specific product. Let's take, for example, Wix Store. So in the editor, it's nicely shown, users come and choose the collection and choose how to design the galleries. While in the store manager in the back office, users come and they can set and edit and manage their collections. They can manage their products, like you see here. They can set shipping and tax rule, different coupons, and also manage their orders. Now, this is just the Wix Store Manager. The design system I'm going to talk about is the one in charge of unifying all these different managers as part of the Wix unified experience. The first thing we always start with is the goal. So the goal this time is to enable team to reach great consistent results much faster. The method we're going to use is to remove communication barriers and facilitate usage of common patterns. We arrive to the system. I'm going to briefly talk about some foundations, about the index and the structure of the elements, and about what is this mysterious word semantics. So the important thing about foundation, as demonstrated here with this typography, is that they got to be well defined and they got to be the same on every platform. Like in this example, if you look at T2 here, it's always going to be Helvetica 55, a 16-pixel font with a 24-pixel line height, which uses the color D10, which is dark 10. And it's going to be the same in every code base we have, whether it's React or Angular, in our sketch files, and everywhere we visit it. And we're using the same methodology for our colors and for our grid systems. Elements. How common is this? Okay, you're trying to talk about an element with a friend using a chat, and you're spending way too much time doing this, right? This is not a really good way to communicate, right? How much more efficient is this, right? So we gotta have a unique ID. That's the first thing we had in mind when we talked about elements. Now, what you see here is a partial list of some of our input elements. And as you can see, even though it's a partial list, there's quite a lot. And I even didn't start to discuss all kind of size variation and different right to left and units that we have inside of it. So our first challenge was to understand how can we have a unique index if we have more than 100 variation and types of elements. So we use the system that we call types and variation. And what you can barely see here is our family of inputs. Let's dive in. So all of our elements are arranged into families. Here you can see the family of inputs, which has a prefix number of 3. So if you see something with a 3, then it's got to be an input element, right? Then we move on to the rows. Each row represents a subfamily. Like in this example, 3.1 is a text field, 3.2 is a text area, and 3.3 is filled with a selection. Moving on to elements, an element's got to have a letter in his name. So we've got 3.3a, which is an element with a single selection, B, double selection, and C, multiple selection. To show all the kinds and variations, we're using variations. Now, variation is basically a modification of the element, and we can apply multiple variation per each element. As a rule of thumb, the basic element is also always the most used one. So for example, in our inputs, it's always going to be text input with a label. So we have common variation like something without a label, number, ticker, all kind of prefix and suffix units, and more. So it allows us to communicate quite clearly. Now in this exaggerated example, we see 3.3b, which is a field with double selection, which is actually a number with a ticker and a prefix of $1. Semantic. Semantic is talking about the actual meaning of the element. Let's see a common example. So 3.4a is a time input, and 3.5a, which is very similar, is a duration input. Now, even though they're almost the same, time represents a time in a day, and it's no duration. But sometimes it seems a little bit petty, right? Like, why are you doing so much? So the real reason is this. Sometimes different stuff have different variation. For example, different subfamily, like the time input one, has got a 12-hour variation, which the duration input doesn't have. So if you keep to your semantics, it makes it much, much better. Second, accessibility. By keeping things semantic and doing what you want to do, just like this light is hurting me, so I'm going to move here, if you don't mind. By making things semantic, it makes it much easier to make things accessible. And accessibility is a big thing in Israel, finally, and I think all over the world right now. And last, it just makes sense. And by that I mean that it makes sense to talk about the actual meaning of things, and it makes the UX designer's job much easier. Like in this example, when we're talking about buttons, then 5.1 is our standard button, which appear on a white card. 5.2 is a white button, which appear on a dark background. Each subfamily has got a primary and a secondary. So as a UX designer, if I'm designing on a white card and I already got a primary button, then I've got no decision to make. I know exactly which button to use, which allows me to focus on the more important stuff. The mess. So the first question is what causes this mess? Okay, and I'm going to talk about a few stuff. First, you just hit the ground running, right? There's no beginning. You just start, everybody's running, and you got to run with them. Second, everyone is agile. Robert, I know you've talked about it. So imagine the enormous amount of moving parts, right? 20 different companies, different vibes, different technology, all running to accomplish roadmap features when everybody is agile, which means that basically needs keeps changing and everybody wants it ASAP. Last, it's the people themselves, right? So we've got a few kind of very different internal users, like with the extreme being developer and designers. And from my experience, nobody likes dependencies or being told what to do, which a lot of the time design system feels like it. Now, what can we actually do about it? Communication is key. Okay, and I'm going to share a few aspects of communication that we used and how it helps us to solve some of this mess up. We're going to talk about definition as a common base for communication. We're going to talk about sharing and planning. And we're going to talk about, in general, about how we can facilitate communication for the greater good. So, definition. As we already discussed about type and variation, in order to have any kind of discussion, any kind of conversation and engagement, you got to have a really good base of definition, and it's best to have it the same in every platform you're using, like in our example of the index made of types and variation. Sharing and planning. Now remember we talked about 20 different companies and the staggering amount of moving parts. So basically in order to get anything done, you gotta plan something and you gotta share it. So we're using Google Docs, which helps us to share easily and to comment upon everything. And it helps us to get things done. Second, UX QA, right? We gotta make sure that quality is good. Now imagine the kind of index we have with all these types and variation, how hard it is to just keep track of everything. Now another golden rule of communication is to try to make things look as similar as possible on all platforms. So if you can look at this Google Docs, here you see the subfamilies, right? You see the elements, the types, and the variation. So basically, everybody who's shared on this document can get in a glance the exact status of all the UX QA. Last, this tricky subject of animation specs, right? Who here that tried to deliver animation to a developer and was horrified by the experience? Okay? So we try to communicate as best as we can around it. So we created this format using Google Slide, in which in the first slide, you see the actual animation itself, like here. Then we arrive to the specs, which are shared by the different elements in the time. And in the last one, we see the timeline, which basically, hopefully, will erase all kinds of questions. In the last section, I'm going to talk in general about facilitating communication with a few examples. So we're using Zeppelin here for the specs. Who is using Zeppelin? Okay, or all the other Avocode and everything else, right? So as you can see from the specs, we're trying to make them as clear as possible, with basically no question need to be asked further than the specs. Furthermore, as we discussed in Foundation, we have a very defined style guide with all the colors and all the text style we talked about before. On the designer side, we have quite a big sketch file, which you can also see the colors, and they're very accessible from the document colors, from the color field styles, and of course the text stylers are applied here as well. Remember the huge index we talked about with the text field input, for example? So common variation are like something like no label, number, ticker, prefix, suffix unit. Let's take a look at the developer side now. So this is a documentation center using Storybook. And what you can see here, that the developer has the variation here on the left, and he can actually see a demo of the component he gets. So in this example, it chooses a small field, a number, with a prefix unit of $1 with a ticker. Then basically he just copies the code and it's good to go. And we basically have similar thing for all the elements that are ready. I just want to share the last example of the buttons, which basically here, the developer can also set the prefix icon straight from here. And even just apply the right text. Basically, no coding required, right? That's the end goal. On the designer side, in our sketch, then every element is a symbol. Most of them are as responsive as possible. And a lot of them, the designer can customize without even breaking the symbol. Like in this example, we mimic the storybook with basically a designer can just change the icon and change the text on the button, very similar to what like the developer used to do. Again, different places trying to behave in the exact same ways. An important part of facilitating communication is teaching and advocating. You got to make sure people understand the tools you're working about and understand the value of what they're getting. Here you see a picture taken in a full-day sketch workshop that we offered for product manager so they can better understand our tools to allow us for a better communication. And last, communication is all about the people, right? And being part of quite a big family, like Wix with over 70 UX designers, much more developer, designers, product managers, and more. Basically, being the focal point for communication means actually being there for them, right? Answering the question as they go, listening to the complaints often, and solving the problems. Because in the end, being there, knowing the people, and constantly engaging in a conversation is the best way to facilitate communication. Thank you very much.